Critical Race Theory, an Explanation, Part 2. This is University Quick Course. In our first video, we talked about some of the historical and theoretical underpinnings of critical race theory. In Part 2, we're going to talk about what is critical race theory anyway. Critical race theory is an academic concept that is more than 40 years old. The core idea is that race is a social construct and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but something embedded in legal systems and policies and in American social and cultural life. The basic tenets of critical race theory, or CRT, emerged out of a framework for legal analysis in the late 1970s and early 1980s, created by legal scholars Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, among others. Core tenets of critical race theory. 1. The social construction of race. Critical race theorists argue that race is socially constructed, not biologically natural. The biological notion of race, the idea that the human species is divided into distinct groups on the basis of inherited physical and behavioral differences, was finally refuted by genetic studies in the late 20th century. Social scientists, historians, and other scholars now agree that the notion of race is a social construction. Some critical race theorists hold that race is an artificial association or correlation between a set of physical characteristics, including skin color, certain facial features, and hair texture, and an imagined set of psychological and behavioral tendencies conceived as either positive or negative, good or bad. The associations have been created and maintained by dominant groups, in the United States white Americans of Western European descent, to justify their oppression and exploitation of other groups on the basis of the latter's supposed inferiority, immorality, or incapacity for self-rule. 2. Second, racism in the United States is normal, not aberrational. It is the ordinary experience of most people of color. Although extreme racist attitudes and beliefs are less common among whites than they were before the mid-20th century, and explicitly racist laws and legal practices, epitomized by the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation and denied basic civil rights to African Americans in the South, have been largely eliminated, most people of color continue to be routinely discriminated against or otherwise unfairly treated in both public and private spheres, as demonstrated by numerous social indicators. African Americans and Hispanic Americans, Latinxes, for example, are on average more likely than similarly qualified white persons to be denied loans or jobs. They tend to pay more than whites for a broad range of products and services, e.g. automobiles. They are more likely than whites to be unjustly suspected of criminal behavior by police or private white citizens, and they are more likely than whites to be victims of police brutality, including the unjustified use of lethal force. If convicted of a crime, people of color, particularly African Americans, are generally imprisoned more often and for longer periods than whites who are found guilty of the same offenses. Many blacks and Hispanics continue to live in racially segregated and impoverished neighborhoods, in part because of zoning restrictions in many predominantly white neighborhoods that effectively exclude lower-income residents. Predominantly black or Hispanic neighborhoods also tend to receive fewer or inferior public services, notably including public education. The lack of quality education, in turn, limits job opportunities, which makes it even more difficult to leave impoverished neighborhoods. On average, blacks and Hispanics also receive less or inferior medical care than whites and consequently lead shorter lives. Many instances of racist behavior directed at people of color take the form of microaggressions, which are verbal or behavioral slights, generally subtle and often unintentional or unconscious, that communicate a stereotype or negative attitude toward a person of color and thus indicate an implicit bias based on race. Microaggressions may also be directed at members of other oppressed or marginalized groups, such as women and LGBTQ persons. For example, in a real-life case discussed in the CRT literature, a white professor at an elite university, in conversation with colleagues in a campus building, sees a black student walking down the hall and immediately exclaims, loudly enough for the student to hear, that the colleague should have locked the door to her office because she left her purse there. The common occurrence of racial microaggressions is indicative of the pervasiveness of racist attitudes, even among people who consciously reject racism, and their cumulative effect on people of color can be psychologically devastating. 3. Third, interest convergence. Owing to what CRT scholars call interest convergence or material determinism, legal advances, or setbacks, for people of color tend to serve the interests of dominant white groups. Thus, the racial hierarchy that characterizes American society may be unaffected or even reinforced by ostensible improvements in the societal status of oppressed or exploited people. For example, Derek Bell, one of the forefathers of CRT and the first black tenured law professor at Harvard University, argued that this thesis of interest convergence can be tangentially be exemplified by the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, which overturned the segregation-supporting separate but equal doctrine established in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. Bell argued that this legal precedent occurred when it did because 1. Elite whites were concerned about potential unrest among black former soldiers who had fought bravely for their country in World War II and the Korean War but were now expected to return to lives of oppression and exploitation by whites, and 2. The world image of the United States as an egregiously racist society threatened to diminish American influence among developing countries and to undermine the country's strategic efforts in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. So because of these converging conditions, it was in America's best interest to strike down segregation in American schools. Although widely dismissed at the time, Bell's view that the Brown decision was a product of interest convergence between whites and blacks was supported by later historical research, which indicated that the decision of the U.S. Department of Justice to side with proponents of desegregation was influenced by a raft of secret communications from the U.S. State Department regarding the need to improve the country's image abroad. The thesis of interest convergence has since been applied to numerous other legal cases involving the rights of people of color, particularly black people. 4. Fourth, differential racialization. This holds that members of minority groups periodically are subjected to varying sets of negative stereotypes, again depending on the needs or interests of whites. These stereotypes are often reflected in popular culture, e.g. in movies and television, and literature, as well as in the news media, and they have even influenced the content of history curricula in public schools. Well into the mid-20th century, for example, black people were widely conceived and depicted as simple-minded, childlike servants and laborers who were content in their subordination to and segregation from whites. Later, following civil rights protests in the 1950s and 60s that challenged the unjust domination of American society by whites, blacks, and especially black men, came to be viewed as natural-born criminals prone to violence, or as lazy leeches living off social welfare programs paid for by hard-working whites. 5. Fifth, the thesis of intersectionality and AntiEssentialism. According to the thesis of intersectionality, or AntiEssentialism, no individual can be adequately identified by membership in a single group. For example, an African American person, may also identify as a woman, a lesbian, a feminist, a Christian, and so on. 6. Sixth, and finally, the voice of color thesis holds that people of color are uniquely qualified to speak on behalf of other members of their group or groups regarding the forms and effects of racism. This consensus argues that the self-expressed views of victims of racism and other forms of oppression provide essential insight into the nature of the legal system. In general, in the United States, we see good examples of these tenets in practice. For example, with the second tenet, race and racism is a normality in American society, not an aberration, we can see that in the 1930s, government officials literally drew lines around areas deemed poor financial risks, redlining. This practice, called redlining, was employed to explicitly exclude whole communities due to the racial composition of inhabitants. So, in practice, this means banks refused to offer mortgages to black people in those areas. Today, this still happens. We see those same patterns of discrimination live on through policies like single-family zoning that prevents the building of affordable housing in advantaged majority white neighborhoods and thus stymies racial desegregation efforts. Concluding thoughts. CRT has ties to other intellectual currents, including the work of sociologists and literary theorists who studied links between political power, social organization, and language. And its ideas have since informed other fields like the humanities, the social sciences, and teacher education. This academic understanding of critical race theory differs from representation in recent media, and especially from its portrayal by critics, often, though not exclusively, conservative Republicans. Critics charge that the theory leads to negative dynamics such as a focus on group identity over universal shared traits, divides people into oppressed and oppressor groups, and urges intolerance. Thus, there is a good deal of confusion over what CRT means, as well as its relationship to other terms like anti-racism and social justice, with which it is often conflated. To an extent, the term critical race theory is now cited as the basis of all diversity and inclusion efforts, regardless of how much it has actually informed those programs. This modern, ideologically diverse understanding of critical race theory has led to much misunderstanding, misinformation, and disinformation about the topic. This is University Quick Course. Please like and subscribe.